I'm Janice Omadeke, Culturati co-chair, a CEO, and an entrepreneur at heart. We are thrilled to be joined today with Tristan Walker. I am beyond excited as an entrepreneur of color. Tristan has paved the way for a lot of possibilities for millions and millions of founders out there. So upon him joining our prep meeting, I couldn't help but begin singing his praises. Among his strong track record of success, he is the first Black CEO under Procter & Gamble, and he serves on the boards of Foot Locker and Shake Shack. He's also the co-founder of Code 2040. My company, The Mentor Method, helps Fortune 1000 companies build inclusive mentorship programs in under an hour. So this focus on inclusive businesses means a lot to me, and I'm excited to dig into that with Tristan and my Culturati co-chair, Albert.
Hi, my name is Albert Swantner. I'm one of the co-chairs of Culturati this year. I'm the co-founder and CTO of a company called Mobile Tech RX that makes software for the automotive reconditioning industry. And I'm, like Janice, starstruck and so excited to be here with Tristan today. And I want to jump right into it. I know we have lots of questions about culture. Janice, what are some of the things we've been talking about?
Great, thank you, Albert. So let's start off with just getting a benchmark understanding of the meaning of culture. So our first question is, simply put, how do you define culture, Tristan?
Yeah, look, I have been a part of way too many corporations that don't define it. Traditionally, culture has been about liking the other person subjectively. Oh, this person plays golf. Oh, this person makes me laugh. And I thought it was a bunch of BS. And I felt if I was going to start a company, I had to define it from the very start. So about a month before I actually raised my first cent of funding from Walker & Company, I remember walking into a Starbucks out in Mountain View, California, on El Camino Real. I remember it very vividly. I sat down for 45 minutes and I said, wow, like what has gotten me from projects of Queens, New York, to this position, to be in a position where I can raise millions of dollars for my company? There are a set of kind of 6 values that I wrote down that I felt got me there. I wrote them down, I defined them. They're courage, inspiration, respect, judgment, wellness, and loyalty. And I defined it. And what I wanted really to do with those values is really have a set of values that would help me make decisions objectively, not only in my personal life, but also for my company, right? So everyone who kind of comes to my company, yes, you can go to walkerandcompany.com and actually kind of read what those values are, how they're defined, et cetera. But it really does guide every single thing that we do. When we interview you, we'll ask you leading questions to get at your courage and inspiration and respect. When we do your semi-annual, annual reviews, you're rated against your goal attainment, but also your adherence to these values. I want Walker & Company to outlast me. And the only way that we can do that is if we maintain this consistent set of values that follows when I'm in the room, when I'm outside of the room.
Excellent. So as the leader of Walker & Company, I think it's inspiring that you're able to set that trend. But going down levels in terms of the leadership structure, how do you ensure that your mid-level managers that are really the sort of core people managers are living these values on a daily basis?
Yeah, I mean, it starts from before they get in the door. It starts before they even kind of the day one of the company. So when I talk about the interview process, that's what I mean by that. What values does is it provides a set of shared language, right? So when we think about the definitions, whether it's coming from the CEO or our most junior employee, folks can call me out when they feel that I am not living up to the values. Hey, Tristan, I don't believe that you were respectful to this customer for such and such reason. Hey, I don't think you were loyal to this employee's needs for such and such reason. And I think the problem that I had seen in companies that I've been a part of before was a lot of the junior folks couldn't find a voice because it wasn't a shared set of shared language to be used to define that culture and reinforce it. I think that has allowed us at least to have, whether it be the kind of intermediate levels, junior levels, and most senior levels, to provide language to hold everybody accountable. And I think it has worked pretty well for us.
Fantastic. So given this shift to a virtual workforce, being in a post-George Floyd world, numerous studies have come out showing that chief diversity officers is one of the leading careers now that's high in demand. With that, the majority of chief diversity officers tend to be Black or people of color. So if a company is starting to hire, let's say, their first set of underrepresented executives when maybe they didn't have any or had maybe 1 or 2 before, what advice do you have for our audience to make sure that companies are starting that shift and ensuring that the rest of their team is ready for those adjustments?
Yeah, well, first of all, congratulations for thinking about this stuff, right? It really starts with the acceptance that this is powerful, important, and critical for not only the business, but also your employees. Now get back to the set of values that, look, we have a company that's majority people of color, majority Black women in positions of leadership at my company. This has not been hard. And I think it maps back to these values that we have. They are not gender specific. They are not ethnicity specific. These are a set of values when you think about courage and inspiration that everyone really can adhere to and follow and want to be a part of. And I also say that it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have values that are genderless or so on and so forth. But the employees who are applying to those companies, you know what you're getting yourself into, right? So I chose those values very deliberately, and that's led to, for the 8 years that I've been running this business, well over 90% have always been people of color. Well over half of my management has been Black women in positions of leadership consistently. And I think it really starts with this definition, because that definition makes people really understand what purpose means for the company. And as you have established that baseline, it does a couple of things. Number one, the folks that are within the company, that they might now realize, hey, this is not a company that has my own shared values. I need to go, right? And it also might attract folks that do have those shared values, right? But first, it starts with setting that baseline. Without that baseline, it's hard to move one step forward.
Thank you. I also love that you mentioned that it's not hard, because it really isn't, especially when you start weaving it into just the values and the company overall. Yeah. So you mentioned 8 years building Walker and Company, extremely successful. Have you seen a change in terms of your roster of values over that 8-year period? And follow-up question to that, upon your acquisition and becoming a part of Procter & Gamble, how did you balance bringing your core values under a more established umbrella?
Yeah, great question. People change, values don't. I've shared with a lot of folks, albeit controversially, I'll always hire a jerk who shares my values before I hire a nice person who doesn't, right? The reason for that is, look, let's say that, I've hired that jerk. Now I have a shared language to help articulate to that person why that behavior is unacceptable. It's much harder when we don't have those shared values. It doesn't mean that you can't be an effective leader at the company. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It's just, I want to optimize my time around people who share my values, right? There's only 24 hours in a day. As it relates to Procter & Gamble, we had a choice around to whom we can partner, right? And Procter & Gamble is it because, we have those shared values. Like Procter & Gamble defines it themselves on their website. I got to meet the people who happen to be there 20, 30 plus years. There's a reason that they continue to be there. We had a mission to make health and beauty simple for people of color, right, around the world. They care about, delighting the 5 billion consumers around the world that they have, who majority of whom are people of color, delighting them every single day. So Procter & Gamble also knew what they were getting themselves into. This is the point around shared values that I talk about. Like, they have a choice, and they leaned into this choice because they felt that our communication of those values, the way that we express them to consumer employees, really matched the way that they kind of saw a future for the world. So there are a lot of folks that might not even realize, consumers, that we are a part of a larger Procter & Gamble now. There's been such a consistency in the way that we kind of engage with our consumers. There's a consistency in the way that we engage with our employees that didn't cause any disruption or changes with the acquisition. That's one of my kind of most proud things to have done as the CEO of this company.
Awesome. I want to talk a little bit about the startup ecosystem that we're in. Part of being a CEO and a founder is you go around pitching, right? You go meet VCs, you meet PEs. And in my experience doing that, you look around the room and there's not a lot of people of color, right? You look at the entrepreneurs before you pitching, the ones after you pitching, not a lot of entrepreneurs of color. So it kind of makes it feel like the startup ecosystem is broken, right? But somehow you've managed to buck this trend. So first of all, why is the system so broken? How do we fix that? And then how did you buck that trend and be so successful with the constraints?
Yeah, I'll start in reverse and turn around bucking the trend. It's important for me to express what my privilege is, right? My experience was particularly singular, right? So, I am a person who's raised tens of millions of dollars to sell his company to a Fortune 100 company. I went to Stanford Business School. I graduated from my university, top of my class. I went on full scholarship to one of the top boarding schools in the country. Before all that, like I grew up in the projects, like it was, all the kind of privilege that I've attained has compounded over time. So I think it's important for me to kind of express that because, my story hasn't scaled yet, right? And it'd be unreasonable for me to kind of pontificate about this without kind of sharing that. So let me kind of park that to the side for a second. I think about the startup ecosystem. I think about it's being full of three things. Number one, people, ideas, and money, right? The thing when I think about folks of color, I like to this quote that I hear all the time is that genius is evenly distributed, right? But opportunity is not. And this gets at the heart of what you're talking about right now. How do we fix this? Well, you got to have people in the rooms, right? So in the same way that we're talking about these values, I'd be curious, what those moneyed interests, what their values are. Ask them, right? And well, it might teach you a couple things. Number one, that, hey, maybe these aren't the people that you want to work with, right? For one. And two, when I speak to a lot of entrepreneurs, I also give them the truth. It's hard enough to raise money as just an entrepreneur, period. The math suggests that like, you're probably not going to raise money. So what's your plan if you don't? And I think if you actually have an understanding around what that plan B is, it maybe should be your plan A, right? I think a lot of folks go into this having this belief that raising money is the end all be all, is the thing that's going to make them successful. My having raised money caused all of my problems like at my company. So I think, again, the way to buck the trend is own your stuff, right? Sometimes you need to right size or rationalize or narrow the ambition you have in the interim so you can own your stuff and actually kind of get to the product market fit that you have where, when you're ready to raise the money, it's just more expensive for them, right? The one thing that we cannot do is snap our fingers and have folks on the other side of the table look like us. That's going to take way too long, unfortunately. Right? So what's our plan B? That maybe should be our plan A. Does that make sense?
That totally makes sense. And so when you're thinking about raising money, do you kind of interview the VC to make sure their values align with your values? Does that help guide the conversation of who's on the board and kind of help with some of that diversity?
It would be nice. I gave this kind of flowery speech about 30 seconds ago, but at the end of the day, as an entrepreneur, like money is oxygen, right? There are going to be some VCs that are willing to give you money, a lot who are unwilling to give you money. And if you're in a position like me, where in order to build what I wanted to build, you needed $2.5 million, right? I could have like really, really rationalized like what that scope would be, but I don't know what the company would have been in my context, right? Because the problem we were trying to solve required like a pretty multivariate approach. So that said, as I think all this stuff through, you might not have time as an entrepreneur to really assess, all right, this guy's willing to give me $2 million. I need $1 million. Let's make sure that the values are aligned. But there are ways that you can actually, if that's on shaky ground, let's say, right, you can structure your organization so that you mitigate the risk of not shared alignment. Maybe those people aren't on your board, right? Maybe if you've gotten the money already or you've gotten the term sheet, then you come and say, hey, here's how I rock. Right? Here's how I work. Here are the things that matter to me. So I'm going to take this money, but please keep in mind that kind of here's the rules of engagement for me, right? We don't all have the luxury of perfect alignment with kind of ability to raise money. I wish we all did, which is why I talk about this plan B stuff. But entrepreneurship, as you know, we don't have the luxury of time. So I would like to say otherwise, but unfortunately, it's not otherwise.
Yeah, I understand that. Got to do what you got to do sometimes.
That's right. That's right.
So, I think the world's changed a lot in the last year and a half. I think Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, has really come to the forefront, and companies are finally speaking up a little bit about time. But I feel like a lot of companies are paying lip service to this, and they post something on their LinkedIn or their Instagram, right? But I think it's not really in the core of who they are. So I think, what's your advice for companies who really actually do care and want to build it into the core of who they are, but then weighed against, you're scaling, you're going through startup pains, you're just trying to survive, right? So how do you do that?
Yeah, I think it's easy. Fortunately for us, we were, well, let me kind of take it back. I was about to say we were ready for it, but no one's ever ready for this ridiculousness, right? We were prepared to know what to do, right? Because we already had the values already set. There's a way that we approach things. Over the past year, I just had to compartmentalize it and articulate it in a different way. So here's what I told the team, and here's what I kind of shared other folks that are really kind of wrangling with this and trying to think about it. First and foremost, if you're going to step out and make a commitment or a statement, before you can do all that, like acknowledge the trauma, right? There have been hundreds of years of lasting trauma that need to be acknowledged and hopefully eventually reconciled, but at least acknowledged, right? If you can't acknowledge it, then get out the way, right? Once you've acknowledged it, I think now you can actually model the way, right? How do you model the way? It comes down with like your defined core values. How are you going to pick a side without knowing what your values are, right? This is what I mean about our being prepared. We're prepared to model the way because this is how we rock. These are our values. Now, once you've modeled the way, now you can act, right? And you can do things that are authentic and real in a way that your consumers, employees will actually believe. And I'm shocked. I think the reason why you get a lot of discord between the acknowledgement and action is because there's too much gray area in the modeling. And that goes back to all the stuff that we've been talking about around values. If you don't know who you are, how are other people? And that's it.
That's a really good point. So I think there are a lot of companies out there, and just being honest, right, that basically have an entirely white executive team, a white board of directors, white investors, but some of us are trying to think about how are we going to speak to a diverse audience when we're just not diverse, right? Is there a way to do that and be authentic, or is it always going to come off a little bit tone deaf because you're just white people there, right? Like, talk about that.
I appreciate the question. My favorite sweater. I like sweaters. That's all I wear. One of them says, proud of my blackness and yours, right? Everybody has a blackness in them, right? Like the cultural influence of Black folks around the world is not only something that I believe in, but at least when we think about Americans, 75% of Americans believe it to be the same. The clothes that you wear, the music that you listen to, the food that you eat, right? Like there's a blackness in you too, right? And the way to embrace it is to do just that. Like, for lack of a better word, like what is my blackness? Like what about this culture actually gets me authentically excited? And the great thing about, I think, our community is that we can see right through it, right? Like we know if it's real or if it's not. Let me map it back to these values. How can you model the way and act, right, without understanding of the values? This is all connected. Like it just really is. It's not enough for, as you say, like an all-white executive team to turn around and be like, hey, Black Lives Matter, like we support it. Like, show us what you believe, right? And show us the things that you do every single day to make us believe. Oh, and by the way, if you actually believe these things, you'd be hiring more of us, right? So, I mean, again, like perhaps it takes some time, right, to kind of make the transition hire, find the right people. This is not like a binary thing that's like a week long. Like this is a long arc towards the future that we all want to exist. But show your progress, right? And show your blackness.
I love that. Thank you. Another thing people were trying to do to make some impact, right, is they started these DEI funds. I know Andreessen Horowitz has one. Do you think that that's helping the ecosystem? Do you think those targeted funds are going to have the impact that they're hoping?
No. I mean, I raised money. Most of my money came from Andreessen Horowitz. I love Andreessen Horowitz. But, speaking as a founder, like, I want main fund money. Now, that said, right, like, going back to cash is oxygen, more cash is better. So take that money if you get it, right? Like, you should not be discriminating in that regard. Then it goes back to intentionality. I hate to be like a broken record on this stuff. What have you articulated in the past? What are you doing consistently? How are you modeling? And then when you act, now it either makes sense or it doesn't. Like, I try and break things. Look, being an entrepreneur is hard enough. The way that I can actually maintain my own sanity and mental health and all that stuff is to have a set of rules and guiding principles to live. Values is one of them. This acknowledgement, modeling, and action. That's the entrepreneurial experience, right? And the stuff, all the questions that you're asking can be very simply answered by thinking about things in those two ways, right? So look, I mean, maybe a DEI fund is great if you have a fundamental belief that diversity is the thing. I have a belief that this shouldn't be separate. Diversity, Blackness, is the reason you exist, right? Let me give you a perfect example. And this is the one that I share. And talk about my kind of Latino brethren and sisterin, right? Year 2040, folks of color, the majority of this country, all right? If Facebook were built in the year 2040, would it be Spanish language first or English first? Right? Now, you ask this question around an executive team of all white men, right? Like, diversity is the business plan, right? So in your acknowledgement and your modeling, if you have a DEI fund, is that the business plan or not? It's hard for me to think about it as a subordinated, separate thing when it is the thing.
Awesome. So just shifting focus a little bit towards more kind of focus, right? So we all struggle with that. So you often speak about 3 core areas of focus. Can you talk to us about these areas and why they matter to you?
Yeah, I mean, like, look, well, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to I have a quick question. What are those 3 areas? Is it the model, acknowledgement, and the action?
Yes.
I think that sounds good. Yes.
Yeah.
And by
Sorry
the
about
way, I have just been actively listening this entire time, but I'm just going to replay this every day, every time I'm in an investor meeting or continuing to scale out the mentor method because of these valid points.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's simple. And it is, each of these things are things that everybody can understand, and sometimes people forget, we're working every day and it's fair, right? Like we're busy, we have families at home, right? But acknowledgement, modeling, action, that's something you do at home, right? Acknowledge what's going on, like set principles for my kids to do the right thing and then do things, right? It works in the office, it works everywhere. And I think once you start compartmentalizing things in that way, everything makes sense and it doesn't feel as overwhelming as some make it to be.
I have a follow-up question to that, Tristan. With the 3 core focus areas, do you see them scaling or adjusting based on career levels or level of responsibility within a company? So for example, does modeling look different for you as the CEO compared to, say, an intern that's joining your team for the summer?
Yeah, I think modeling, probably not. The action, yes. Well, actually, let me take that back. My interaction with the modeling is the definition, right? We've defined what the values are. We've defined the guardrails, right? The action, everyone has, based on kind of their position within the company, like the guardrails are pretty wide and you can work within that as long as you've worked within these tight kind of modeling the way guardrails. And I think it's the reason why it's so scalable is because, the way that I act is going to be different than the way that my most junior person acts, but it doesn't make it any better or worse. It's just different. And it allows us to do more things and have better ideas, right? So by kind of establishing kind of the guardrails, at least from a values perspective, it gives folks room to innovate, right? It gives room to innovate. You could have the craziest idea if you were courageous in your kind of in your acting on it. If it's inspiring our employees and our people, if you're respecting the needs for our consumers in our community and you're being loyal to those needs as well, if you've practiced a good judgment along the way and you're taking care of yourself and not killing yourself working on it, I'll probably love it, And again, it goes back to the shared language. When you say that there's something that you want to do, use our language to do it. And it'll be not only more palatable, but it's likely something that we'll want to do.
Excellent. Thank you for clarifying that. I've noticed sometimes the responsibility can be put on, say, the CEO or mid-level managers, depending. So I thought that clarity would be good for the audience. So last set of questions. Let's look at sort of the bigger picture and sort of putting this all together, because we've discussed values, we've discussed your 3 core focus areas, we've discussed that it's going to take quite some time to get that level of equity that we should be seeing in the world, right? So what would be a good first step just to get it started?
Yeah. Spend 45 minutes at a Starbucks, right? And write it down personally. And I'm not talking to CEOs when I talk about this. I'm talking to everybody, right? We're in a messy world. There's a lot going on. How are you going to make decisions? In my last year before we sold the company, I was working with an executive coach who I still work with. He's wonderful. He's like a kind of neuroscientist and is a performance coach. And then also had my own therapist. And it was a tumultuous year for us, right? Like, we had to do a reduction in force. We couldn't raise money. We had all these large CPG companies wanting to buy us. Like this, it's just crazy. I bought a home to move to Atlanta before we even had an acquisition. Like it was like nuts. I was going to have my second child. Like all this stuff was happening. And what's interesting is for each of them, I would go and I kind of dwell on things for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and I'd come to them and say, "Hey, here's what I've been thinking about." And they'd always ask me the same question. They'd say, "What do your values tell you to do?" And I knew the answer right away, right? Like it unlocks something for you where you can actually move into a world that is messy and you can do it consistently. And shouldn't you be only doing the things that are in line with your values? There's no argument of doing otherwise. So, I say the most breakthrough period of my life were those 45 minutes when I actually wrote them down. Like when I fundamentally wrote them down. It's given me my own grace, right? To when I'm feeling stressed, to actually say, you know what? I did what I felt was right, right? It gives me time back. It allows me to say no more, right? And it allows me to very quickly see when I need to say yes more, right? I would guarantee you that all the folks that are going to be watching this right now, 98% of the people plus have not done that. We'd have a much better world, a much better country, a much better everything if we knew what we were talking about when we talked about values, right? So the only thing that I can say, and I say this in every class I teach, every chance that I can get, spend 45 minutes, reflect on that life, give yourself the grace to write them down, define it, and win your time back.
I love that concept of spending time in the strategy. We don't spend enough time in that. So even if it's 45 minutes, that's so important.
Yeah.
So I want to shift over to talking about Code 2040 and some of the social good front of that, since you are the co-founder of that organization. So tell us a little bit about Code 2040 and how you're helping to transform the cultures of tech companies who end up hiring the talent through your program.
Yeah, I started Code 2040 to ensure what happened to me does not happen to other folks who look like me. I didn't know Silicon Valley existed until I was 24. I had the good fortune to get into Stanford for business school and go out there and realize it existed and get into tech and all that stuff. I was way too old at that point to have not recognized that this was an opportunity. Like I was kind of in New England, I'm a New York baby. Like I thought Wall Street was like my pinnacle. And I moved out to Silicon Valley. I was like, wow, this is a really amazing place, right? For potential wealth creation, et cetera. So I, probably my second year in business school, I think. No, actually, a year after my graduating from business school, I read this amazing book. It's called Race Against the Machine. It was written by an MIT professor. And the thesis is kind of as follows. The gap between the rich and the poor is the starkest it's ever been. There is no middle class. It's never coming back, right? The reason why you have this kind of 1%, 99% things because folks at the very top are leveraging technology in ways to make them a hell of a lot more productive, while the folks at the bottom, quote unquote, are not, right? So if you're going to kind of chase wealth and participate in this new innovation economy, you have to participate in this new innovation economy. And I wanted folks to recognize what was out there well before folks turned 24. So the goal of Code 2040 was to get the highest performing Black Latino engineering undergraduates internships out in Silicon Valley and provide them with all the tools they needed to be incredibly successful. Media training, fireside one-on-one chats with tech luminaries, the Ben Horowitzes, the Mark Andreessens, that sort of thing, right? And the ability to build community. We're, 8 years in, 9 years in, something like that. And we have a 90+% full-time offer rate for that program. I mean, Code 2040 has expanded into kind of a much broader kind of racial equity and justice lens with tech as a core focus. But 90+% full-time offer rate, Silicon Valley's full-time offer rate in general is not that high. We proved that we can get the best and brightest talent. Genius is evenly distributed. Opportunity is not. We want to close that opportunity gap. And I think Walker and Company really showing people. It's one of my proudest things that I've ever been able to build. That we're showing people that we're giving them opportunity. And I think now that we're as many years in as we are, we're starting to see these kids start companies, raise millions of dollars to do it, hire people who look like them, right? We all need to be participating in this new innovation economy. Like, this is something for all of us, Black, white, whatever, right? This is where the wealth is going. We have to have some semblance of understanding. And I couldn't let my story scale in the way that it did up until I was 24.
Thank you for sharing that. So 90%, that's a phenomenal number. What would you say to the companies that are still trying to claim that there's a pipeline issue and can't identify diverse tech talent to hire?
Well, I mean, look, it's much like everything else. There's not a pipeline issue. There's a lot of, I mean, there's an overwhelming number of folks that are kind of trying to get these degrees, and they just don't know the opportunity. I'll give you a perfect example. The first Code 2040 summer, we only had 5 fellows. It's like well over 100 every summer or something like that now. But we had one gentleman who was a 4.7 on a 5.0 GPA at MIT, computer science, co-president of his school, and varsity athlete. Had no idea about Silicon Valley, right? Now, Silicon Valley goes to MIT all the time trying to recruit these kids. How did he get missed? How's that possible, right? Now, of course, if he has a problem, imagine a kid at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, right, which has a really strong computer science program, all right? So the folks who say that, they're full of it. They're lazy. They're lazy. And that point that I gave you a little earlier around 2040, Facebook, Spanish language, et cetera, like I fundamentally believe this. If you do not have an approach or strategy to making that diversity, like non-subordinated, but an actual thing, if you do not have a strategy for that, you won't be around in 20 years. Full stop. I don't care what company you are. So if you don't listen, that's fine, right? You'll get disrupted. You're going to die. Your company's going to die a pretty terrible death, and that would be unfortunate, right? Because you could have been thriving in this inevitable future.
I agree 1000%, especially being in the equity space. When I hear people say that there's still this pipeline issue, it makes my skin crawl almost, because there's plenty of pipeline if you're actually actively seeking it out.
That's
and
right.
Again, ties to your values about ensuring that a diverse pipeline that reflects the world around you is a part of your core values. So yeah. Tristan, I have personally spent a lot of time, researching your interviews. I know that several of my colleagues and friends were excited for me for the opportunity to speak with you. So I would be doing a good friend of mine a disservice if I didn't ask this one last question.
Cool.
So the question is, what advice do you have for the middle portion of fundraising as a Black founder?
Middle portion of fundraising. Wow.
I'm sure you remember. So let's say, so this is.
I don't want to remember. That's the thing. Go ahead. Keep going.
I don't blame you. So this individual is currently raising a seed round as well. And so they've gone through the first yeses halfway through. And, it's sort of that middle ground of, okay, who's leading? Do we need a lead, etc.? So even though you don't want to remember, I know that you inspire so many pre-seed, seed, and beyond founders, and specifically Black founders, that I would just love to hear what your take is. And I can take this back to my friend and say that I definitely did that for him.
Yeah, perseverance matters. It's easy to look back and see, look, I was on cover of magazines, I've had all this press, blah, blah, blah. I raised 40 million, but I raised all that $40 million. You know what? My competitors raised hundreds of millions and more, right? When I raised my first round of funding, I needed $2.5 million. Folks talk about, pedigree, blue ocean opportunity, right? Like, do I trust this person? Like, check, right? I pitched probably 60, 70 people, and 4 people said yes, and these are all the people who said, before I started the company, they would say yes. until I came up with this idea, right? So look, I mean, the only thing that I could say, and you know, it's number one, recognize, acknowledge how hard it is. Too few people actually want to let the math guide their decision making. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a part of that equation, but you have to respect it. Like you have to acknowledge it, right? Because if it happens to you, now what are you going to do? How are you going to model the way, right? Like, and how are you going to be guided? Well, sometimes, at least for me, I had to have the courage, right, to know that it might not happen. So I'm going to take what I have and make some do out of it, right? Oh, and by the way, have a plan B as well, right? And that's where kind of some of the action comes in. But I think the best thing that I can do for your friend is to remind that friend that it has to be acknowledged, right? And if you can acknowledge and still persevere throughout, it's likely that it's going to kind of go your way, right? But it's more likely that like you might come up with a more, or let me, for probably a better approach, a different approach, right? To really knowing what you need. There's a difference between want and need, right? And I had to very much realize that quickly when I was raising money, how much I actually needed versus how much I wanted. The difference between those two things, to me, in a lot of ways, is greed. And it's the thing that got me into a lot of trouble as I continued to raise money over time.
Okay, that was going to be, I know I said that was the last question, but that was going to be my follow-up question after that of, you know, 40 million is nothing to, you know, laugh at, and that's incredible. I understand the sort of the comparison of your peers, and I was going to ask, you know, how that impacted you as a leader and a CEO. So that's extremely helpful. So last
question.
Can I
say one thing that's really important? Raising all that money was the worst thing that ever happened to me, honestly.
Say more. What do you mean?
Like well, it's worse than best. Like I'm a big believer of the fact that, like, you know, a lot of people ask me if I could have done it all over again, what would I have done? And I probably would have said I would have done the exact same thing, because it made me realize one thing: how much ownership and autonomy mattered to me. Right? I raised all that money, only realized later I had to pay it back. Right? And it forces you to make decisions that you wouldn't have made if you owned the damn thing. Right? So for me, moving forward, now that I've learned that, I care more about ownership and autonomy. You know, a lot of folks say, yeah, it's easy for you to say you raised $40 million. I'm like, yeah, it's easy for me to say because I raised $40 million, right? And I have a respect in my acknowledgement of like what, how it affects me in ways that you might not necessarily recognize. So it's your choice to raise the money. That's fine if you believe that that's the right thing to do, but also recognize what you're trading off for it. And the best thing to happen to me was to recognize what I traded off for it.
That makes perfect sense. So you mentioned moving forward. What's next? What are you working on? What's exciting you right now? What's on the docket? Let us know. Let us see how, and how can we help you as well? Not that you need it, but it's always good to know.
No, help is always warranted and necessary. And look, I mean, for me, I think my career is somewhat predictable. And here's what I mean by that. For the past decade, and you know, God willing, the next 5 decades, you know, I've only cared really about 3 things from a business perspective. Right? First is the demographic shift happening in this country and the cultural influence of people of color around the world. I think it is singularly the most important theme of my lifetime, and I'm dedicating my life to it. Secondly, technology, and certainly its impact on business, but in a more nuanced way, it's mapped back to this demographic shift. How do you promulgate this cultural influence in a scalable, fast way, right? And unlock a powerful asset for the world to share with the world. And then lastly, I love great brands. I love great brands, not just because they're great brands, but also because they could be a force for good in the world. And every single thing that I've done sit at the center of those 3 concentric circles. Walking Company, Foot Locker, Shake Shack, Code 2040, right? Anything I do here forward is going to sit squarely in the center of those 3 concentric circles. I care about consistency in that way. So, you know, this idea of like help, you know, and, you know, my help is with values. If you share the same values that I have and you care about the, like also sitting at the center of those 3 concentric circles, yeah, I love to talk, right? And much in the same way that you asked a little earlier, you know, junior, senior, like how do people kind of work? And I said, you know, these sets of guardrails and and while you have guardrails, you still have ingenuity that can kind of creep out of that. It's the same here. If we have shared values and you care about that centricity, there's a lot of ingenuity that can come out of it, and a lot of opportunity, and frankly, a lot of money, right? That can not only for yourself, but also kind of with that money, rinse and repeat, to offer some good to the world.
Fantastic. Tristan, I got the note that it is unfortunately time to let you go, but on behalf of Albert and myself, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for speaking to two other entrepreneurs about the land of entrepreneurship and how that intersects with values and culture. And thank you for sharing your insights with the Culturati community.
Thank you guys. What a fun time. And I kudos to each of you too for doing the work. It gives me a ton of inspiration, and someday I'll be able to do it again.
Thank you.